The move the pawn to c4 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to c5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to f3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to e6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to d4 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black mirrors white's approach, establishing symmetry. This solid, accurate response keeps the dynamic balance intact. White develops a knight, showing a standard setup, a solid, accurate move that keeps the position balanced. The move the knight to f6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to g6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to d4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the knight takes on d4, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the knight to f6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to c3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White reinforces development with another knight, a solid, accurate move maintaining the dynamic balance. The move the pawn to b6 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to e6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to g3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to d5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the c-file takes on d5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the e-file takes on d5 executes a favorable trade. This allows the pawn to d4, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to g3 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to e4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to c6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to d4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the c-file takes on d4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the knight takes on d4 executes a favorable trade. This allows the bishop to b7, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black develops the bishop to a strong diagonal, a solid, accurate move that supports the pawn structure. White fianchettos the bishop, creating a stable structure, solid, accurate development maintaining the positional equilibrium. Black mirrors the fianchetto, solidifying their kingside. Accurate play keeps the dynamic balance. White castles, securing the king. Solid, accurate development, maintaining the dynamic balance. Black develops the bishop to its fianchettoed square. A solid move, giving white a slight positional edge. White pushes the central pawn, opening lines. Solid development aiming to exploit the dynamic balance. Black captures, clarifying the center. A solid, accurate move that maintains the dynamic balance. White recaptures with the queen. Solid development, consolidating the slight advantage. Black develops the knight towards the center. Solid play, maintaining the current slight advantage for white. White repositions the queen actively. Solid development, maintaining the slight advantage. The move the rook to c8 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to b8, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the rook to d1, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the queen takes on f4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the bishop takes on f4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Unlocking the knight to d8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook on the a-file to c1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White shores up the queenside pawn structure. Solid, accurate play that maintains the slight advantage. Black centralizes the knight. Solid development, but white maintains a clear slight advantage. White exchanges queens. Solid play, simplifying the position while retaining the slight advantage. Black captures the knight. Solid development, but white still holds a slight advantage. White repositions the rook to the b-file. Solid, accurate play to maintain the advantage. Black develops the bishop to its fianchettoed square. Solid play, maintaining the slight advantage for white. White maneuvers the queen aggressively. Solid play, keeping white's advantage. Black advances the kingside pawn. Solid play, but white's advantage persists. White repositions the bishop. Solid development, consolidating the slight advantage. Black castles, securing the king. Solid play, maintaining the positional pressure. White exchanges the fianchettoed bishops. Solid play, maintaining the slight advantage. Black recaptures with the king. Solid play, but white maintains their slight advantage. The move the rook on the f-file to d1 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook on the b-file to d1, activating the rook on an open file. Paving the way for the rook to c7, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the knight to e1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the pawn to d6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the knight to c2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to d7, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black advances a central pawn. Solid play, helping to maintain the dynamic balance. White centralizes the knight. Solid play, re-establishing a slight advantage. The move the bishop to a8 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to d7, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Paving the way for the knight to c2, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the pawn to f5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the knight to e3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the rook to f7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to b4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White repositions the knight to a strong outpost. Solid play, maintaining the advantage. The move the pawn to a6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to d7, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Paving the way for the rook to d2, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the knight to e5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the bishop takes on a8, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the rook takes on a8 executes a favorable trade. This allows the queen to d4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops the knight to a central square. Solid play, consolidating the advantage. Black repositions the rook to the second rank. Solid play, increasing pressure. White centralizes the other rook. Solid play, reinforcing the initiative. Black centralizes the queen. Solid play, maintaining the pressure. White repositions the queen. Solid play, maintaining the initiative. Black maneuvers the queen actively. Solid play, keeping the game dynamic. The move the queen to e3 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to d5, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the pawn to h5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to d2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to f6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to h3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to e5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the rook on the f-file to c8 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to b5, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the queen takes on a7 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on a7, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the bishop takes on a8, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the rook takes on a8 executes a favorable trade. This allows the knight to d5, guaranteeing long-term space control. White advances the knight to a strong outpost solid play, maintaining a clear advantage. Black centralizes their knight, solid play, but White's advantage remains substantial. White develops the bishop to attack, solid play, maintaining the clear advantage. Black repositions the rook, solid play, White's dominance continues. White centralizes the queen, solid play, consolidating the clear advantage. Black moves the king to safety, solid play, but White's superiority is overwhelming. White repositions the rook, solid play, maintaining the clear advantage. The move the queen to b7 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop takes on d5, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the pawn on the c-file takes on d5 executes a favorable trade, which enables the rook to b7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to d2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to h5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to f4, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the bishop to g2 by White is a mistake. A superior alternative was the rook to e3, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the queen to a7, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to e4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to f5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to h4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to f7, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black repositions the queen, solid play, consolidating their position. White advances the kingside pawn, solid play, maintaining the initiative. Black repositions the knight, solid play, preventing further immediate breakthroughs. White pushes the central pawn, solid play, aiming to open lines. Black advances the flank pawn, solid play, contesting space. The move the pawn to e5 by White is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to h4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to e5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to e3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the king to g7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to f5 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the bishop takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black captures the pawn, solid play, maintaining the equality. White recaptures with the pawn, solid play, maintaining the equality. Black advances the central pawn, solid play, maintaining the equality. White develops the knight, solid play, keeping the position balanced. The move the rook on the b-file to d8 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the bishop takes on g2, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the queen takes on d7 executes a favorable trade, which enables the queen to a8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to g4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook on the b-file to d8 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the knight takes on h6 with check, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the bishop takes on a8 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to g4, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the bishop takes on g2 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the king takes on g2, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the pawn to h5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, allowing the knight to h6 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety. This allows the king to g7, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black recaptures with the queen. Solid play, consolidating their position. White repositions the rook. Solid play, maintaining the advantage. The move the queen to f3 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the knight to b8, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the queen takes on b6 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook takes on d3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the rook takes on d3, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the pawn to h5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to d8, guaranteeing long-term space control. White repositions the queen. Solid play, solidifying the decisive advantage.